The destroyers came out of the dark like a pack of wolves, their searchlights slicing across the moonlit sea. USS Harder lay just beneath the surface, barely hidden, her crew hearing the sonar pings hitting their hull like hammer blows. Commander Samuel Dealey stood in the conning tower, calm as stone, watching 3 Japanese destroyers close in at full speed. Each one carried enough depth charges to tear a submarine apart in seconds. The nearest destroyer zigzagged so hard its bow threw white spray 20 feet into the air. Every man aboard Harder knew that once those ships locked on, they wouldn't stop until someone was dead. Dealey raised the periscope and saw the lead destroyer turning directly toward them, her guns ready to fire the instant Harder broke the surface. He whispered one quiet order that froze the crew in place. A simple command no submarine captain was ever supposed to give. Turn the bow straight into the attack. Prepare for a down-the-throat shot. If you're enjoying this already, I'd really appreciate a quick subscribe, and I'd love to know where you're listening from tonight. If it's getting late on your end, take care of yourself first. We're not young anymore, and you can always come back to this story when you're rested. Commander Dealey's world at that moment was a cramped steel tube 30 feet under the waves, and every inch of it vibrated with the sound of approaching engines. The Japanese destroyers hunting him were fast, well-armed, and confident. They believed submarines always turned away, always ran deep, always tried to hide. That belief had kept dozens of American boats alive for the past 2 years, but it also meant no destroyer captain expected what Harder was about to do. Dealey had spent 5 patrols watching how these hunters behaved. He'd seen them charge recklessly when they thought a submarine was retreating. He'd seen them drop patterns of depth charges based on habit instead of thought. And now, with 3 destroyers converging quickly, he knew exactly what decision would break those habits. The conning tower lights were dimmed to red, casting every face in a quiet, tense glow. The crew listened to the sonar operator calling out bearings, each ping growing sharper as the destroyers tightened their search pattern. The ocean above was shimmering silver under the fading moon, and the destroyers cut through it like blades. Dealey lifted the periscope again and studied the nearest one. Minazuki, about 1-200 tons, 4 5-inch guns, and a captain who probably thought this would be easy. She was closing fast, too fast for a safe dive, too fast for a traditional attack. Dealey knew he had only seconds to make a choice. You can almost feel what the crew felt as they braced themselves. They weren't panicking, but they weren't relaxed either. It's a strange sort of fear. The kind older sailors sometimes talk about. The kind that settles quietly in your chest when you understand exactly how dangerous the next minute is going to be. The Harder crew trusted their captain, and that trust mattered more than they realized. Dealey wasn't guessing. He was calculating. A destroyer charging head-on left. No time for evasive maneuvers if torpedoes suddenly appeared in its path, and if the angle was right, if the timing was perfect. The destroyer captain wouldn't have the seconds needed to swing his ship clear. Dealey ordered Harder's bow pointed directly toward Minazuki. No hesitation. No wavering. It was the kind of maneuver that violated every page of submarine doctrine written before 1944. But that's exactly why it worked. The destroyer expected a submarine trying to escape. What she got instead was a submarine rushing straight toward her at attack speed. The crew felt Harder shift beneath their feet as the helmsman brought her around, the submarine tilting slightly. the engines humming harder. Outside, the destroyers formed a perfect triangle around Harder, each one tightening its pattern. Sonar pings filled the water with sharp, metallic echoes. The men in the control room could feel the noise through the hull, like distant thunder hitting the steel. Then the call came from the periscope, range decreasing, Minazuki closing. Harder was now bow on, fully committed, no turning back. Dealey waited for the exact second, the moment where the destroyer's angle prevented her from dodging without overshooting. Everything slowed. The tension, the sound, even the men breathing. And then Dealey gave the order that defined his legacy. Fire. Take her down. That's where the story truly begins. Because this wasn't luck or recklessness. This was the birth of a tactic that would change submarine warfare forever. See, when Harder dove after that first torpedo spread, the explosions rising through the water weren't just noise. They were the sound of a pattern taking shape. A pattern born 2 months earlier on a gray April morning when another destroyer thought it could bully an American submarine. That destroyer was Ikazuchi, and she had a reputation among Japanese sailors as a reliable hunter. Her captain had chased submarines from the Solomons to the South China Sea, and on April 13th, he spotted Harder's periscope wake and charged without hesitation. He probably thought he was dealing with just another cautious American skipper. What he got instead was Samuel Dealey. Harder's crew remembered that day in a way only men who served together can describe. Even years later, Ikazuchi came roaring in at flank speed, her bow throwing up white water like she meant to ram straight through the ocean itself. Her guns were already manned, her depth charges set, everything about her posture screaming confidence. The safe move. The move any submarine manual would have told you to take was to go deep and pray. Every officer on Harder's bridge expected Dealey to order exactly that. Everyone except Dealey. He studied Ikazuchi through the periscope, the destroyer growing larger with every passing second, and the crew waited for the dive order. Instead, Dealey told them to bring the bow up and make best speed directly toward the attacker. You can imagine how that felt below decks. A submarine charging a destroyer was almost an insult to the laws of nature. Destroyers were faster, louder, and meaner, and they were designed to kill boats like Harder. But Dealey didn't flinch. He understood something the Japanese hadn't realized yet. When a destroyer committed to a ramming run, she had almost no time to react if a torpedo suddenly appeared in her path. Her speed, her angle, her momentum, everything locked her into a narrow decision window. And Dealey aimed straight at that window. Harder's engines pushed her ahead at full power. The men felt the bow rise as the helmsman held a steady line. Through the scope, Ikazuchi filled the view, her hull cutting toward them like a blade. At 900 yards, with less than a minute left before impact, Dealey fired 4 torpedoes in a tight spread. For a heartbeat, nobody breathed. Then the water lit up with 2 violent flashes. The destroyer's midsection erupted, flames bursting through her superstructure. Ikazuchi rolled, broke, and was gone in 5 minutes. The shock of that kill traveled far beyond the crew who witnessed it. Word spread across the Pacific submarine fleet, carried in brief radio messages and whispered in wardrooms, expended 4 torpedoes and 1 destroyer. It sounded almost casual, but it wasn't. It was unheard of. Submarines weren't supposed to fight destroyers. They weren't supposed to win those fights, and they certainly weren't supposed to win them head-on. Admiral Charles Lockwood, the man who oversaw America's submarine force, understood what it meant right away. A submarine captain willing to charge destroyers flipped the entire rulebook upside down, but the Japanese grasped it too, though in a different way. Admiral Toyota, the man responsible for holding Japan's shrinking supply lines together, saw Ikazuchi's loss as a warning. By spring 1944, he'd already lost more destroyers than he could afford. Losing one to a submarine that attacked instead of fleeing threatened every assumption his commanders relied on. That's why. When Harder reappeared off Tawi-Tawi 2 months later, the Japanese didn't treat her like a nuisance. They treated her like a threat. And they sent more ships, more patrols, more destroyers ready to kill anything that moved underwater. But Harder wasn't slipping away into the dark this time. She was about to turn Ikazuchi's lesson into something far bigger. Because the real story wasn't one destroyer going down in April. It was what happened when Harder faced 3 destroyers at once. The lesson Ikazuchi left behind wasn't forgotten. It stayed in the back of every man's mind as Harder slipped through the warm Philippine waters in early June. The crew didn't boast about it, and they didn't talk big. Submariners rarely do. But they carried a quiet certainty now, the kind that settles into a ship after a victory that shouldn't have been possible. They knew they could hit back, and they knew Dealey would never ask them to do anything he wasn't willing to risk himself. That trust mattered more than any torpedo. For 9 days, Harder moved undetected, a silent shadow near Tawi-Tawi while the Japanese mobile fleet gathered in one of its last strongholds. Battleships, carriers, cruisers, and more destroyers than anyone on Harder cared to count. It was the biggest concentration of Japanese naval power since Midway. The men on Harder didn't know all the details, but they could feel something heavy in the air. The way the ocean sometimes feels different before a storm. When the Japanese patrol plane spotted Harder's periscope wake in the early hours of June 6th, the storm arrived all at once. 3 destroyers responded immediately, closing from different angles with the kind of speed only ships built to kill submarines could manage. Minazuki took the lead. Behind her came Hayanami and Tanikaze, spreading apart just enough to trap Harder in a deadly funnel. The sonar pings came faster, sharper, almost impatient, as if the destroyer captains believed the kill was already theirs. But Harder wasn't retreating. She was maneuvering. Dealey watched Minazuki's approach through the periscope with a steady hand. The destroyer zigzagged hard, trying to spoil a torpedo shot, her bow cutting black water into bright silver spray under the rising sun. Every few seconds, Dealey lowered the periscope to reduce the chance of another aerial sighting. The conning tower was tight, hot, and silent, except for short commands and sonar reports. If anyone was afraid, it never reached their voices. Dealey turned the bow toward Minazuki. It was the same maneuver that had killed Ikazuchi, but this time the stakes were even higher. There were 2 more destroyers watching. They were close enough to hear the explosions if he failed. Range closed fast. The crew braced as Harder tilted slightly, committing to the charge. Sonar reported decreasing range. The control room felt smaller with every call. When Minazuki reached 1,100 yards, Dealey's voice cut through the red glow of the conning tower. "Fire 3. Take her down." The torpedoes left their tubes with a familiar surge, a sound the men could feel through the decks. Harder dropped at a steep angle, diving under the oncoming destroyer while the crew grabbed whatever they could, holding as the bow pointed down like a spear. 40 seconds later, the ocean shook. One explosion hammered the hull, then another, and then a third that lifted the stern hard enough to toss loose equipment against the bulkheads. A few light fixtures shattered. Men cursed under their breath as they steadied themselves. When Harder leveled off and Dealey brought her back to periscope depth, the view was empty water and a spreading oil slick. Minazuki was gone. The other two destroyers weren't charging. They were running. That should have been the end of the danger, but it was only the beginning. Admiral Toyota received the report that morning and was furious. Destroyers were precious now. Japan had lost too many, too fast, and needed every single one to guard convoys and protect the mobile fleet. Losing one was bad. Losing one to a submarine that attacked instead of fleeing was worse. Toyota dispatched 6 more destroyers to comb the area and ordered aircraft to sweep overhead every 20 minutes. But none of that stopped Dealey. Harder surfaced after nightfall to recharge her batteries, the dark sky hiding her silhouette. At 0312, radar picked up a fast-moving contact, a destroyer, Hayanami. She'd been searching for submarines since midnight, and her captain was exhausted, probably ready to head back to base. He didn't expect an American submarine to be charging him on the surface. Harder pushed ahead at her maximum speed of 21 knots, closing the range deliberately, slipping inside the destroyer's radar detection window. Hayanami's operator didn't spot them until Harder was already too close. At 3,000 yards, Hayanami's captain realized the truth. He ordered flank speed and turned to ram, but Dealey had beaten him to the punch. 4 torpedoes left Harder's tubes at 2,300 yards. 2 struck near the aft magazine. The explosion tore the stern clean off. Hayanami rolled sharply, her propellers thrashing the water as she went under. 148 men vanished into the dark. 2 destroyers in 24 hours. It was no longer an anomaly. It was a pattern. Toyota understood that. That's why he pulled 8 destroyers from convoy duty and formed them into hunter-killer groups with one mission: find Harder, kill Harder, make an example of the submarine that had humiliated the destroyer fleet. But Harder wasn't finished. On June 8th, she approached Sabutu Passage, a narrow stretch of water constantly patrolled. Dealey knew destroyers would be there. He wanted them to be there. That afternoon, Harder spotted 2 moving in a standard zigzag search pattern. Tanakaze and an escort. Dealey watched them for 90 minutes, studying the rhythm of their turns. He positioned Harder perfectly, patient as a rifleman waiting for his target to step into the open. When Tanakaze finally turned toward Harder, she unknowingly steered straight into the kill zone Dealey had prepared. The range fell. 2,500 yards, 2,000, 1,500. At 1,200 yards, Dealey fired 4 torpedoes at 17-second intervals. The first missed. The second struck near the bridge. The third hit the forward magazine with a detonation so violent the blast could be heard inside Harder, even with all hatches sealed. Tanikaze broke apart. Both halves sank within minutes. The escort charged Harder immediately, dropping depth charges on the run. But Dealey took the boat deep, 400 feet, 40 minutes of pressure and concussions and metal groaning in the dark. Yet Harder survived. 3 destroyers in 3 days. It was no longer simply impressive. It was historic. And it still wasn't the end. Because the next morning, 4 more destroyers waited ahead, sweeping the sea with sonar so loud Harder's sound operator could hear it without headphones. Dealey had 8 torpedoes left, 4 destroyers in formation, and 1 perfect opening. The 4th destroyer went down just after sunrise on June 9th, and for a moment the ocean fell strangely quiet. The other 3 destroyers had spent 2 hours hammering Harder with depth charges, shaking the submarine so violently that light bulbs shattered and cork insulation drifted through the air like snow. When the last set of explosions finally faded, the men inside Harder listened to the water settling around them, waiting to learn whether the destroyers would return for another pass. But the sea stayed still. No screws, no pings, nothing. Dealey brought Harder back up to periscope depth, and the horizon was empty. 4 destroyers in 4 days. No submarine had ever done anything like it. What Dealey didn't know was that each sinking hit Admiral Jizaburo Ozawa like a hammer. Ozawa commanded the Japanese mobile fleet anchored at Tawi Tawi, a fleet preparing for Operation A-Go. Japan's final attempt to smash the American push toward the Marianas. It was a bold plan on paper. If everything worked perfectly, Japanese carriers would ambush the American fleet and tear its air power apart before the invasion of Saipan could get underway. But the plan depended on timing. Fuel, reconnaissance, and destroyers. Lots of destroyers. Every carrier strike group Japan still possessed relied on its screen of destroyers to keep submarines away. Without those screens, the carriers were floating targets. By early June, Japan had already lost 23 destroyers that year. Losing 4 more in 4 days was catastrophic. Ozawa didn't see Harder as a nuisance. He saw her as a spear pointing directly into his anchorage, threatening the one weapon Japan couldn't replace. If Harder slipped into Tawi Tawi and found an opening, she could fire a single spread of torpedoes and end the mobile fleet before it even sailed. Reports came in on the morning of June 9th, one after another, each one worse than the last. Minazuki, gone. Hyanami, gone. Tanikaze, gone. A 4th destroyer, hammered and sunk on the 9th. And Harder was still out there, still hunting, still refusing to die. Ozawa did what every commander dreads. He scrapped his timetable. Operation A-Go was supposed to begin on June 15th. He needed recon flights. He needed weather forecasts. He needed supply ships positioned along the route to the Marianas. But staying at Tawi Tawi meant giving Harder 6 more days to stalk his anchorages. 6 days of uncertainty. 6 days where one periscope at dawn could ruin everything. Ozawa messaged Admiral Toyota, asking for permission to depart immediately. They both knew what that meant. Leaving early meant leaving unprepared. Japanese supply ships weren't in place. Destroyers were scattered across patrol sectors. Reconnaissance aircraft had already burned through their fuel allotments searching for Harder, but the alternative was worse. If a single American submarine had already punched holes straight through their destroyer screen, what would happen if more submarines were waiting outside the anchorage Toyota approved the early departure? On the morning of June 10th, the mobile fleet lifted anchor. 4 battleships, 9 carriers, 15 cruisers, 24 destroyers. They moved out in a hurry, too spread out, too loosely organized, and without the coordinated air cover Ozawa's plan required, Harder didn't witness any of it. She was already slipping south, low on fuel, battered by days of combat, and unaware she had just forced the most powerful fleet Japan had left to sail 6 days ahead of schedule. That single shift in timing changed the shape of the coming battle. Those 6 days meant the Japanese carriers reached the Philippine Sea before their recon planes were ready, before their supply lines were set, before their destroyer screen had regrouped. And the Americans knew exactly where they were. Codebreakers had read the movement orders within hours and passed them straight to Admiral Raymond Spruance. The United States didn't need to search for the Japanese fleet now. It knew the path, the speed, even the composition. The Great Marianas Turkey Shoot didn't happen because the Americans were lucky. It happened because Harder forced Ozawa to fight unprepared, and while that fleet steamed east, Harder sailed toward another battle of her own, one she wouldn't escape. Harder's return to Fremantle in late June was quiet on the surface, but the men knew they'd just lived through something no submarine crew had ever done. Admiral Charles Lockwood was waiting at the pier when they tied up, and even he looked a little stunned. 4 destroyers sunk and 1 damaged in 12 days. He handed Dealey the Navy Cross right there on the dock. No ceremony, no speeches, just a silent understanding between 2 men who knew exactly how hard those victories were earned. Then Lockwood asked the question every submarine commander feared. "Can you do it again?" Dealey didn't hesitate. "Give me torpedoes, and I'll sink 10. The crew spent July training, repairing, and getting ready for another patrol. You might think the intensity of those June battles would have weighed them down, but submariners were built from a different mold. They joked, they drilled, they taught the new men what it felt like when the hull flexed under pressure, or when depth charges went off so close the lights blinked. They didn't brag. They didn't relive their victories. They prepared. By the end of July, every submarine commander in the Pacific had pored over Harder's patrol report. The lessons were clear. If a destroyer committed to a charge, you could beat it if you attacked first and with absolute conviction. On August 5th, Harder went back to sea, joining USS Harder and USS Hake in a 3-boat wolf pack commanded by Dealey himself. Their hunting ground lay west of Luzon, a place where Japanese convoys still crept along the coast toward Manila, trying to slip through before the noose tightened. The patrol began well. On August 21st, the Wolfpack intercepted a 16-ship convoy off Palawan Bay and tore into it with coordinated attacks. 4 cargo ships went down, more than 20,000 tons of supplies lost in a single night. The next day, Harder and Haddo engaged 3 coastal defense vessels off Bataan, sinking all 3. Dealey's crew wasn't chasing glory. They were cutting arteries, one by one, in a supply system that was already bleeding out. But success comes with its own dangers. Japanese intelligence had been listening, tracking radio calls between the Wolfpack boats, and by August 23rd they had a rough idea where Harder and Hake were operating. They dispatched 2 special escort ships, CD-22 and PB-102 vessels built specifically for anti-submarine warfare. These weren't big destroyers with broad missions. These were purpose-made hunters, slower, but equipped with effective sonar and a dangerous payload of depth charges. They spent 3 days sweeping the waters off Deishei Bay, drawing narrower circles as they closed in. Neither submarine knew they were being stalked. At 0453 on August 24th, Hake was submerged 4 miles off Hermina Mayer Island. Through her periscope, she could see Harder on the surface, recharging batteries before sunrise. Both submarines were positioning for an attack on a damaged Japanese destroyer that Hado had crippled the day before. Harder was silhouetted faintly against the early morning haze, a dark shape on calm water, unaware that death was already moving toward her. Hake's sonar operator suddenly stiffened, echo ranging, close, getting closer. The escorts were sweeping straight toward Harder. Hake's captain immediately ordered his boat deep, knowing Harder couldn't see what was coming. At 0520, he tried to radio a warning. Silence. Either Harder didn't receive it, or she was already diving. Through the periscope, the men on Hake watched helplessly as 2 Japanese escorts closed in, their wakes cutting hard white lines across the water. At 0530, Dealey spotted them. He ordered a crash dive, pushing Harder down at a steep angle. Her diesel engines were still running as she submerged, leaving a massive frothy trail on the surface that gave the escorts a perfect target. CD-22's sonar operator reported a clear contact at 1,200 yards. Descending fast, but not fast enough. The escort's captain ordered an immediate depth charge attack, the kind meant to crush a submarine before she could escape to deep water. At 0547, CD-22 dropped her first pattern, a full string of explosives set for 250 feet. 3 detonated incredibly close. The hull cracked near the after torpedo room. Seawater blasted through in a violent jet. Harder's stern flooded in less than 90 seconds. The boat pitched upward as the weight dragged her down. Dealey ordered all ballast blown, fighting to surface, fighting to keep control long enough to level the boat. Compressed air roared through the tanks, but the flooding was too heavy. Harder kept sinking. A second pattern hit at 0552, even closer than the first. Bulkheads ruptured. The control room flooded. The lights failed. Emergency lighting flickered and died. Harder passed 600 feet, well below her safe limit. There was no time for final words, no time for anything. The hull imploded under the pressure. One moment she existed, the next, she didn't. Above, the escorts circled the area for 2 hours, dropping additional depth charges to guarantee the kill. Oil and debris slowly rose to the surface. 79 men went with the submarine, including the radio man Calvin Bull, who'd earned a Bronze Star for the destroyer kills just 2 months earlier. Dealey's patrol was over, and the news wouldn't reach the United States until weeks later. But Harder's story didn't end on the floor of the South China Sea, and what came next would prove it. Because while the wreck settled silently into the darkness, the Navy began to understand something remarkable about the legacy she left behind. Word of Harder's loss spread through the submarine force like a cold wind. Men read the brief notice on bulletin boards in distant bases and felt that quiet. Heavy pause that comes when a name you know is suddenly followed by 3 words. Presumed lost. All hands. There were no dramatic announcements on the radio, no detailed newsreels. Submarine patrol reports were classified. The public got a single line. A boat had not returned. Families were left with silence. And silence is a cruel thing when you are waiting for a knock that never comes. In cheated the Navy. Though they were not looking at silence. They were looking at numbers and patterns and the thin paper trail of Harder's 5 war patrols. Those reports told a story that almost sounded impossible. One submarine, 5 destroyers attacked at close range, 4 confirmed sunk in 4 days, 1 more damaged in that last June patrol. All of it born from a tactic that most doctrine writers would have called suicidal back in 1942. Charge the destroyer. Point your bow straight at the threat. Get inside his decision loop before he even understands what he is facing. Admiral Lockwood saw it clearly. Harder had not just sunk ships. She had opened a door. By late summer 1944, 12 American submarines were using versions of Dealey's approach. Tang took down 2 destroyers with down-the-throat attacks. Barb used similar tactics against escorts along the Chinese coast. Flasher applied the idea to smaller warships, hitting convoy screens so hard that merchant captains began to fear the very escorts meant to protect them. The math had changed. Before Harder's 5th patrol, submarines avoided destroyers whenever they could. After it, more and more skippers began to think, if he can do it, maybe I can too. It was not magic. It was risk, plain and simple. The tactic worked beautifully when the enemy hesitated or misjudged the torpedo run. It worked when destroyer captains still believed submarines would always try to run. But success comes at a cost. Japanese escorts adapted. They learned to turn away from a charging submarine, then circle back. They learned to let torpedoes pass ahead by cutting speed at the last second. Submarines that missed their shot sometimes paid for it with their lives. Between August and December 1944, 9 American submarines were lost to destroyer and escort attacks. Men died following the same aggressive spirit that had made Harder famous. Lockwood faced a choice that would keep any commander awake at night: pull his boats back into safer tactics and accept a slower, more cautious campaign, or lean into the aggression and break Japan's shipping system completely. He chose aggression. Between January and August 1945, American submarines operating under those bolder doctrines tore through Japanese merchant shipping. Hundreds of cargo ships and tankers went to the bottom. By summer, Japan had lost most of its merchant tonnage. Factories starved for oil and ore. Warships sat cold at anchor for lack of fuel. You can argue about strategy all day, but it is hard to argue with ports that have nothing left to send out. Dealey never saw any of that. He died 3 months after his greatest victories, killed by the same kind of escorts he had spent a year learning to hunt. But the Navy did not forget him. On March 27, 1946, his widow stood on the White House lawn while President Harry Truman presented his Medal of Honor. The citation spoke of 5 vital destroyers sunk at short range and of a commander whose courage turned submarine warfare on its head. A few years later, the Navy named a destroyer escort after him, USS Dealey, and sent her to sea as a quiet nod to the man they called the destroyer killer. Harder herself received the Presidential Unit Citation for her first 5 war patrols and 6 battle stars for service in the Pacific. Her motto, "Hit 'em harder," became a kind of unofficial banner for aggressive skippers who believed that sometimes the best way out of danger was straight through it. At the Naval Academy, instructors began using Harder's patrols as a case study. Not because modern submarines still fire torpedoes down the throat at charging destroyers, but because the principle behind the tactic still matters. When the enemy expects you to run, charging can change everything. On paper, that is the legacy. Medals, citations, tactics. numbers, but paper is not the whole story. Behind every line in those reports there were faces, families, and people who never got to grow old. And for almost 80 years, nobody knew exactly where their boat had come to rest. The answer finally came on May 22nd, 2024, when an exploration team led by Tim Taylor and the Lost 52 project located Harder sitting upright on the seafloor 12 miles west of DeSalle Bay. After almost 80 years of darkness, her shape emerged from the deep in the glow of remotely operated lights. Her pressure hull still mostly intact except for the scars near the conning tower where the depth charges struck. She wasn't twisted or scattered like so many lost submarines. She was whole, resting quietly in the place where her last fight ended, a war grave preserved by cold water and silence. For the families who had waited generations, it meant everything. They finally knew where their men were. At Arlington National Cemetery, where Commander Dealey is buried. Families of Harder's crew gather every August 24th to leave flowers and speak names that deserve better than fading paper records. They talk about grandfathers who joined the Navy at 19, about uncles who worked in machine shops before the war, about young men who learned to fire torpedoes at targets they could barely see. Harder's crew came from 38 states, farm towns, factory cities, coastal ports, and places so small they don't appear on most maps. 22% of submariners in World War II never came home, the highest casualty rate of any American service branch. These men volunteered anyway. They took the quiet path, the dangerous one, the one where your job is unseen until the moment you change the course of a battle. And that's why Harder's story still matters. It isn't just about torpedoes or tactics or enemy ships that went down in flames. It's about how courage works when the odds are rotten. It's about men making impossible choices in seconds, knowing full well what could happen if they guessed wrong. It's about leadership that turns fear into focus. When you look at Harder's patrols, you're not just seeing a submarine fight. You're seeing what people can do when they refuse to back down from a moment everyone else would have run from. There's a lesson in that for anyone listening tonight. When your enemy expects you to hide, sometimes charging straight at the problem is the only move that works. And maybe that makes you think about your own life a little. Have you ever seen someone make a hard call that changed everything around them? Do you think a commander today would take the same risk Dealey took, betting his life and his crew on a 30-second decision? As this story closes, I hope you carry something from it. These men are gone, but their courage isn't. It's right here, in the records, in the wreck, resting on the seafloor, and in the families who never stopped remembering them. If this moved you even a little, do me a favor and hit that like button. It helps us bring these stories back into the light where they belong. And if you haven't subscribed yet, I'd love to have you with us. We're building a place where these memories don't fade, where real heroism still means something. Before you go, drop a comment and tell us where you're watching from, and whether someone in your family ever served. I'd honestly love to hear it. And if it's getting late on your end, take care of yourself. We're not 20 anymore, and history will still be right here waiting for you when you're rested,